Bob Jackson's in the studio with us now, and it's Southwest Michigan's business. If you've never met Bob before, he's the president of Triax Tube, and perhaps more importantly from the community's point of view, Bob really was pivotal, influential in the fight for an enterprise zone legislation in Michigan and enterprise zone status for Benton Harbor. Bob, let me ask you a question. We've known each other for about 5 years now. Let me ask you a question I've never asked you before. Was it tougher to get enterprise zone legislation for Michigan or enterprise zone status for Benton Harbor?
It was, initially we tried to get the enterprise zone for the state of Michigan. That was unavailable, and we did get a prototype zone for Benton Harbor to illustrate through Michigan what can happen in Benton Harbor.
Are you satisfied with what we have?
We got the designation, and it's for full city limits. In that respect, we're very satisfied. And we have the full attention of the state that they do want to see the business community rebuild itself with its own assets. So in that respect, we were very successful. We did not get all the incentives that we initially wanted, but we also got an authority from the state that is going to evaluate Benton Harbor and see what things will work best to promote business. So as we see those things, we will probably see some more incentives come along.
So you're hoping it's an evolutionary process?
Yes, I think it will be. And they're looking at a 2-year evolutionary period. Then the legislature will sit down, review the results, and see what application enterprise zones may have throughout the rest of the state of Michigan.
So they seem to be willing to go with this evolutionary concept, too?
Yes. Once we got through with the prototyping so they can get a look-see at Benton Harbor, they all fell quite enthusiastically behind the proposal.
Early in his administration, Ronald Reagan was quite a supporter of federal enterprise zone legislation.
Yes, that's what got us.
Whatever became of that?
Well, the federal legislation was to put in 75 prototype zones. He has not had much success in Washington of getting that federal legislation. 27 states have now put in enterprise zones, and they are working very, very well, and they are accomplishing those things that were originally the objectives of an enterprise zone. They are rebuilding the inner areas of depressed cities. Now, there seems to be an evolvement here, and the initial program of the federal government does not seem to take precedent now in the 75 zones. They're looking now at saying, how can the federal support and make the existing enterprise zones more effective? This is now receiving the support of the states. So I think you're going to see an involvement to where the feds are going to look at supporting what the states have already done and done effectively.
Will they be setting guidelines and parameters then, the feds?
I think you will see things such as revenue sharing today is a big issue. The government cannot afford all the revenue sharing that it is presently committed to. They're now saying is perhaps they will continue the revenue sharing in operating enterprise zones so that the federal government can target its assets to where the states feel the urban requirements are the most necessary. So I think you'll see things like that. On the tax-exempt bonding issues, of which the government has to retract some of that. We can't live with the deficits that we have. But they may allow tax-exempt bonds in enterprise zone areas. And this has two effects. It says that the federal government still wants to go in and help rebuild businesses in the urban distressed areas. But it will do so only if the states have already provided a climate to where it can be successful. So the states will no longer have to put the entire assets behind it, but it would then be a coordinated atmosphere between the states and the federal government. And I think that's going to be quite a good development.
It would put more pressure on the Michigan legislature to open up more zones in Michigan. That's
Well, we'll sure have them take a better look at it, I think. I think they would evaluate Benton Harbor sooner. I think they would try out other alternatives to promote the business climate in Benton Harbor. And once that is done, I think they would put it further across the state, particularly if the federal government is participating.
What would it mean, though, for a municipality like a Benton Township that has seen some good growth, not spectacular, but rather good? They wouldn't be able to take advantage of revenue sharing. Do you think we might see the boundaries of zones change to include neighboring municipalities, something taken
Well,
into
that's
that?
all can be done. I don't see any move afoot in Michigan. They're right now just looking at Benton Harbor. But then again, Benton Township is very typical of a lot of the surrounding areas of existing enterprise zones in other states. It benefits because its residents has another source of employment when the urban area that is distressed next to them becomes a more economically viable. All of the surrounding areas have benefited from the enterprise zones. This is the record that is being built by the state enterprise zones throughout the country.
I thought maybe we could give some background to the viewer who isn't quite sure of what an enterprise zone is.
Very simply, it's an attempt by government to make it economically feasible to do business and make a profit in a distressed urban area. They use tax incentives, and they also reduce the government involvement and cut the red tape.
Now, we do have other enterprise zones besides Benton Harbor and Michigan's program. South Bend and Michigan City are two that leap to mind.
Right, they're in Indiana.
Right. Have they been successful in other states?
Oh,
Connecticut,
yes.
I think, has a couple of zones.
Connecticut was one of the original zones. One was pushing very hard for federal enterprise zones. Now is pushing for federal participation in their enterprise zones. In Michigan City, for example, they started with the enterprise zone, and Michigan City had a lot of problems very similar to Benton Harbor. It was on a downtrend, and it was a very unoptimistic approach. Once they got the enterprise zone, there were 2 or 3 or 4 companies that immediately made commitments. That justified the completion of their mall. That justified the completion and extension of their condominium project. That justified the work going on with their marinas. So not only have they got a good base in their industrial area, they have now expanded that to the entire Michigan City area, because their enterprise zone is only a small part of Michigan City. But all of Michigan City is coming back. And a good bit of that has been the optimism and the reality of business enterprise participating in Michigan City.
We've known each other, as we said at the beginning, for about 5 years, and most of that really was because of your efforts for Enterprise Zone. Is there any one thing you learned about working with the state legislature through those years?
Yes, something that I thought would be obvious to correct an urban area and that we could sell within a year or two took 6 years. And then we were still in the process of trying to convince a legislative body of a new approach on how to address a social economic problem. I did not expect it to take this long.
Thanks, Bob. We'll be back with Bob Jackson next week, and we're not going to talk about enterprise zone legislation. We're going to talk about his company, Triax Tube.